The policeman was sure he was right, but his confidence crumbled when he learned that the woman was not who she was thought to be. Don't miss this incredible turn of events. Subscribe to the channel to find out the whole truth and leave comments. What would you do in her place? Erica Wilson had always loved her evening walks. They provided a chance to clear her mind after a busy day. To disconnect from the buzz of emails and phone calls today was no different. The early evening sun cast a golden hue over the quiet streets of the prestigious neighborhood she called home. It was a beautiful sight, one that always made her grateful for the life she had built with her husband Michael. Their house, no mansion, stood proudly among other luxurious homes with its tall iron gates and carefully manicured garden. Erica, dressed in simple sweatpants and a hoodie with her hair pulled back into a casual bun, felt comfortable as she wandered through the familiar streets. The day had been long, and a casual stroll was just what she needed. The air was cool with just a hint of breeze, and the quiet serenity of the evening seemed to embrace her. Calming her thoughts, she looked down at her simple sneakers, lightly scuffed from wear, and smiled to herself. It didn't matter how much wealth she and Michael had accumulated, she loved the feeling of being simple, especially in moments like this. As she rounded the corner, she could see her house in the distance, a grand structure that stood as a testament to their hard work. The long driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges led up to the front entrance, and Erica imagined stepping through the doors to find her husband reading in the study, as he often did. In the even evenings, everything about the neighborhood was pristine. From the polished street signs to the clean sidewalks. Erica had lived here for a few years now, but sometimes it still felt like a dream. Growing up, she never imagined she'd live in a place like this, a place where old money and established wealth made up the foundation of the community. She stopped for a moment, closing her eyes. Taking in the peacefulness, it was one of those rare moments when everything seemed just right, a balance of tranquility and accomplishment. But just as she was about to resume her walk, the sound of a car approaching from behind pulled her out of her thoughts. The slow hum of the engine felt deliberate, and she could sense the vehicle following her. Pace. Erica turned her head slightly, just enough to see a police car crawling toward her. Her stomach tightened for reasons she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the first time she'd seen a patrol in the neighborhood. It was a high-security area, after all, but something about this felt different. The car slowed even more, finally pulling to a stop a few feet ahead of her. She hesitated for a moment, her heart beginning to pound in her chest. Surely it was just a routine patrol. Perhaps they were stopping to check on something nearby. She tried to shake off the unease creeping into her mind, but when the officer stepped out of the vehicle walking directly toward her, the tension only grew. The officer was tall, with a stern expression etched into his face. His uniform was crisp, the badge gleaming under the evening sun as he approached. His eyes locked onto Erica with a kind of cold suspicion that sent a chill down her spine. She had seen that look before, the one that judged before understanding. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice clipped and formal. "Can I ask what you're doing around here?" Erica blinked, her mind racing. What could he possibly mean by that? She lived here. Surely he must have seen her around before, but the way he looked at her, his eyes scanning her simple outfit, her skin made it clear that he had already formed an opinion. "I'm just heading home," Erica replied calmly, pointing toward her house, which was only a short walk away. "I live right there." The officer's gaze followed her gesture, but his face didn't soften. If anything, his expression hardened. The suspicion deepening. "Do you have any identification on you?" he asked, his tone sharp. Erica's stomach sank. She wasn't carrying her ID. She hadn't thought she would need it for a simple walk through her own neighborhood. After all, this was supposed to be a place where she felt safe, where she could relax. But now, faced with the officer's cold stare, she felt anything but safe. "I'm sorry, I don't have my ID on me right now," she said, keeping her voice as polite as possible. "But I can call my husband. He's home right now." The officer's expression didn't change. "You don't have any identification, and you're walking around this neighborhood." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity around here recently." Erica's heart pounded in her chest. "Suspicious activity," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Officer, I live here. I'm just going for a walk." But the officer wasn't listening. His gaze swept over her again, from her worn sneakers to her hoodie. It was clear he didn't believe her. To him, she didn't fit the image of someone who belonged in this upscale neighborhood. Erica could feel the anger rising within her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you a few more questions," the officer said, his hand casually resting on his belt. "We need to make sure everything is in order." Erica stared at him, incredulous. "What do you mean, in order?" "I've told you. I live right here. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's eyes remained hard, unyielding people. "Don't just walk around this area without a reason," he said, as though that alone was enough to justify his actions, "and right now you look out of place. Out of place." The words stung sharper than they should have. Erica's breath caught in her throat. She had worked her whole life to get to this place, to build a life where she didn't have to justify her presence, and yet here she was being treated like a criminal for simply existing in her own neighborhood. "Look," she said, her voice growing firmer. "Now, I'm not going to stand here and be treated like this. I've told you. I live here. I don't need to prove anything to you." The officer's hand moved to his radio. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, operate. I'll have no choice but to detain you for questioning. Detain." Erica's pulse quickened. This was getting out of hand. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her into submission. But she also knew how dangerous it could be to resist the stories. She had heard her entire life of black men and women being harassed, detained, or worse, for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Flooded her mind. "I'm going to call my husband," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He can sort this out." But the officer took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "I'd advise you not to make any sudden movements," he said, his voice laced with a threat. "We wouldn't want this to escalate, would we?" Erica froze, her hand hovering over her phone. The weight of the situation was pressing down on her, suffocating. This was supposed to be her home, her heiress sanctuary. But now it felt like a trap. She glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone who might help. But the street was quiet. The few neighbors who had come out to enjoy the evening, now watching from a distance, their eyes filled with curiosity. But no one moved to intervene. Erica's mind raced. She knew she had to stay calm, to not let the situation spiral out of control, but the injustice of it all burned in her chest. She hadn't done anything wrong yet. Here she was being treated like a suspect for simply walking in her own neighborhood. "I'm calling him," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She slowly pulled out her phone, her hands trembling. The officer watched her every move, his hand still resting on his belt as though ready to act at the slightest provocation. As she dialed her heart pounded in her ears. The sound of the ringing felt like it lasted forever, each second stretching out painfully. Finally, Michael's calm, steady voice came through the line. "Hey, baby," he said, his voice filled with warmth that immediately brought a sense of relief. "Michael," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need you to come home. Now, there's a police officer here, and he's saying I don't belong here." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Erica could hear the shift in Michael's tone, the calm giving way to controlled anger. "I'm on my way," he said. "Don't say anything else. Just stay where you are." Erica hung up her hands, still trembling. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, the weight of his suspicion pressing down harder. But now, at least she knew help was on the way. As she stood there, waiting, the silence between her and the officer stretched thick with unspoken tension. She could feel the eyes of her neighbors on her, but none of them approached. They just watched as if this was some sort of spectacle, a drama unfolding. Before their eyes, minutes felt like hours as she stood there, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her heart racing. She knew Michael would come. He always did. But the fear that had taken root in her chest wouldn't leave, not until this was over. As the first faint sounds of an approaching car reached her ears, Erica allowed herself to breathe just a little. Michael was close, and with him, she knew, came the strength to face whatever came next. The tension in the air was almost tangible, as Erica stood on the sidewalk feeling the weight of the officer's gaze and the silent curiosity of her neighbors. the cool, cool evening breeze, which had felt so refreshing just minutes before now, carried a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. The police officer hadn't moved from his spot, but his stance was rigid, and his eyes tracked her every motion with cold calculation. His hand still resting on his belt never strayed far from his radio, or the holster on his hip. Erica's mind raced. This was escalating too quickly, and she had no idea how to defuse it. The fact that she was simply walking home, that this neighborhood was her home, didn't seem to matter. All that mattered to the officer was the fact that she didn't look like she belonged. Not in his eyes. Not in those of the people who were watching from there. Safe, comfortable homes, minutes ticked by like hours. She could hear the low murmur of voices from nearby porches, neighbors whispering among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. Some stood with arms crossed, faces drawn in suspicion. Others peeked through windows, their expressions hidden, but their presence felt no one offered help. No one questioned what was happening. They simply observed as though Erica was the evening's entertainment, a source of neighborhood gossip. The officer took another step closer. His towering frame seemed to cast a shadow over her. His presence overwhelming, his cold blue eyes narrowed as he surveyed her, assessing her every move, every twitch, as if she were some sort of threat. Erica's skin prickled with anxiety, her pulse quickening with each second that passed. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice sharp and commanding. "I've already asked you for identification. You don't have any, and that's a problem. We've had reports of suspicious individuals in this area, and you match the description, Ion." Erica clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to stay calm. "I've told you," she replied, her voice as steady as she could manage. "I live right here. My husband is on his way, and he can explain everything," but the officer wasn't interested in explanations. His gaze darkened his expression, hardening as if her words only fueled his resolve. "This is a high-security area," he said, his tone accusatory. "We can't just take anyone's word for it, especially when there's been a report of suspicious activity." Erica's stomach churned. "Suspicious activity," he kept repeating, as if that alone justified everything that was happening. She wanted to scream, to demand that he explain what exactly she was being accused of. But deep down, she knew the answer. The only thing suspicious about her in the office's eyes was the color of her skin and the simplicity of her clothing in a neighborhood like this officer. "I'm telling you the truth. I live here." "I'm just trying to get home," Erica said, again, hoping that somehow reason would prevail. But even as the words left her mouth, she could feel that it wouldn't matter. The officer sighed impatiently. "I've already told you, ma'am, if you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to detain you for further questioning." He shifted his weight slightly, and the gesture sent a wave of dread through Erica's body. He was serious. "Detain me," Erica asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "For what? I haven't done anything wrong. You're refusing to provide identification and explain what you're doing in this area," the officer replied, his voice growing more aggressive. "That's enough to raise suspicion." Erica's anger flared, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She knew she couldn't afford to let her emotions take control. Not now. Not when things were so volatile. "I've already explained," she said, her tone more measured. "Now, I don't have my ID on me because I'm just out for a walk. I live in that house, right there. My husband will be here any minute, and he'll clear everything up." The officer's eyes narrowed further, his jaw tightening. "We've had break-ins in this area recently," he said, as if that was reason enough for his actions. "We can't take any chances." Erica's patience was wearing thin. "This is absurd," she muttered more to herself than to him, but the officer heard her, and the coldness in his expression intensified. "Ma'am, I don't appreciate your tone," he said, stepping even closer, his large frame looming over her. "This is a matter of public safety. If you can't cooperate, I'll have to assume you're hiding something." Erica's heart pounded in her chest. The situation was spiraling out of control. She knew that if she didn't tread carefully, things could get much worse. But how could she cooperate with something so blatantly unjust? How could she stand here and allow herself to be treated like a criminal in her own neighborhood when she hadn't done anything wrong before she could respond? She heard the faint sound of a car engine approaching, followed by the familiar deep hum of her husband's vehicle relief washed over her, but it was tinged with frustration and anger. This shouldn't be happening. None of this should be happening. Michael's car pulled up to the curb, and she could see the tense expression on his face. Even before he stepped out of the car, he was dressed impeccably. As always, a tailored suit, polished shoes, his presence exuding calm authority. But there was an edge to his movements, a barely controlled anger simmering beneath the surface. He walked over quickly, his eyes flicking between Erica and the officer. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet intensity. The officer straightened his posture rigid as he addressed Michael. "We've had a report of suspicious activity in the area, and your wife doesn't have any identification on her. We're just trying to ensure public safety." Michael's jaw tightened. "Suspicious activity." He repeated, his voice dangerously low. "My wife lives here. This is her home. What exactly is suspicious about her walking in her own neighborhood?" The officer shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to back down. "As I've said, sir, we've had some break-ins recently. Your wife matches the description of someone who may have been involved." Erica felt her anger rising again. What description, she demanded, her voice shaking with frustration. "A black woman in a hoodie. That's the description," Michael placed, a calming hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying her, but also conveying the same anger she felt. "You've overstepped, officer," he said, his voice cold. "My wife doesn't need to justify her presence here. This is our home. We pay taxes in this neighborhood. We've lived here for years, and we've never had any trouble until now." The officer looked from Michael to Erica, clearly weighing his options. He knew he was in a precarious position. Michael wasn't the kind of man who could be easily dismissed or intimidated. His calm, composed demeanor carried weight, and it was obvious the officer was beginning to realize his mistake. But instead of admitting his error, the officer's pride kept him from backing down. He stood taller, his hands still resting dangerously close to his radio. "I'm just following protocol, sir," he said, his voice firm. "If there's been a report, we have to investigate. Protocol." Michael repeated, his voice sharp. "What protocol allows you to harass my wife on the basis of a vague description and no evidence? You're treating her like a criminal, and she hasn't done a damn thing wrong." The crowd of neighbors had grown, and the whispers were louder now. Erica could see more faces watching the scene unfold, but still, no one intervened. Some looked uncomfortable, others indifferent. She could feel their eyes on her, feel their judgment, but none of them spoke up. They simply watched, as if waiting to see how this would play out. Michael took a step forward, his voice luring to a dangerous calm. "I suggest you reconsider your actions, officer. My wife has told you the truth, and you're standing here wasting time harassing her when you should be doing your job." The officer's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked between Michael and Erica, and for the first time since the confrontation began, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by stubbornness. "I'm just doing my job," the officer muttered, his tone defensive. "We have protocols in place for a reason," Michael's voice sharpened. "Your job is to protect this community, not to target people based on their appearance. This," he gestured toward Erica and the scene around them, "isn't protection. It's profiling," the word hung in the air, heavy and charged. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. Erica watched him, her pulse quickening again. She knew Michael was handling it, but the fear still gored at her. She didn't know what this man was capable of, if pushed too far before the officer could respond. Michael took another step forward, his voice firm and commanding. "Now, I suggest you step away from my wife and let us go home. If you continue this, we'll take it up with your department, and I assure you it won't end well for you." The officer's face flushed slightly, his hand twitching toward his radio, but he didn't speak. The weight of Michael's words, combined with the growing attention of the crowd, seemed to be sinking. And slowly, reluctantly, the officer took a step back, though his posture remained tense. Michael didn't wait for further argument. He turned to Erica, his hand still gently resting on her shoulder. "Come on, baby," he said softly. "Let them go inside." Erica nodded her legs, feeling weak, but her heart swelling with pride at how Michael had handled the situation together. They walked toward the grand gates of their home, the officers' eyes burning into their backs as they moved. The murmurs of the crowd followed them. But Erica no longer cared. They were safe now inside their own home. But as the gates closed behind them, she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Inside the grand house, the door clicked shut behind Erica and Michael, sealing them off from the watchful eyes of the neighborhood. But the weight of what had just happened still clung to the air. Erica's heart continued to race, and the tension sea oiled in her muscles hadn't yet released. Michael's strong, comforting presence beside her was the only thing keeping her from collapsing under the emotional burden she had carried through the entire ordeal. Michael led her into the living room, where the warm lighting and familiar surroundings provided a stark contrast to the hostile atmosphere outside their home. A sanctuary from the outside world should have been a place where she could unwind. But instead, it felt heavy with the residue of what had transpired. Erica sat down on the couch, her hands still trembling as she replayed the scene in her mind. The officer's accusing eyes, the crowd's silent judgment, and the way her voice had trembled when she tried to explain herself. All of it made her feel small, even now that it was over. Michael was still standing, his fists clenched at his side. As he paced the room, she knew him well enough to see the storm brewing behind his calm exterior. He had held it together out there for her sake, but the anger was simmering just beneath the surface, and she could feel it radiating from him. "Are you okay?" he asked finally, his voice soft but laced with a barely controlled edge. Eric nodded, though her throat was tight and she couldn't quite meet his eyes. "I'm okay, I think," she whispered, her voice catching. "It's just, that was worse than I expected. I didn't think it could get that far." Michael stopped pacing and came to sit beside her. He took her hand, his grip firm but reassuring. "I'm sorry, Erica. You should never have had to go through that. Not here, not anywhere." His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the fury behind it. She swallowed hard, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "It's not your fault, Michael. It's just this world we live in." "I know," he said, his voice tight, "but it doesn't make it any easier, and it's not something we can just brush off." He paused, his jaw clenching as he tried to rein in his anger. "This isn't over." Erica looked up at him, her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Michael said, his voice growing firmer, "that officer isn't going to get away with this. He humiliated you, treated you like a criminal in front of everyone, and for what? Because of some vague description that you happen to fit." His eyes flashed with determination. "We're going to file a complaint. We'll make sure this doesn't just disappear." Erica felt a knot in her stomach. She knew he was right, but the idea of escalating this further filled her with dread. "I don't know, Michael. What if it just gets worse? What if it brings even more attention to us? I don't want to be that family, the one that people are always whispering about." Michael's eyes softened, and he squeezed her hand. "Baby, we're already that family, whether we like it or not. People were whispering before this even happened, and now they've seen it with their own eyes. We can't just let it slide if we do. It'll keep happening to us to others." Erica bit her lip, the weight of his words settling on her. She knew he was right. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long if they didn't stand up now. When would they? She hesitated, her voice trembling. "I'm scared, Michael. What if no one believes us? What if they find a way to twist this?" Michael's grip on her hand tightened. "We won't let them. We've got the truth on our side. And I have been through this before. Hell, my whole career has been about standing up to this kind of injustice. We'll fight this, Erica. We'll fight it together." His words brought a sense of calm that she hadn't expected. Michael had always been a rock, and knowing that was ready to stand by her side through this battle made her feel a little braver. But even so, the thought of reliving the humiliation of drawing more attention to herself and their family was daunting. "Okay," she said, softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We do it. But I need you to lead the way." Michael nodded, his expression resolute. "I will." The next morning, the first thing Michael did was contact their lawyer, a longtime friend and colleague, who specialized in civil rights cases together. They laid out the facts of what had happened, preparing to file an official complaint against the officer and the Willowbrook Police Department. Erica sat quietly during the meeting, still processing the weight of what was happening. She knew it was the right thing to do, but part of her still felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her life had been put under a microscope. Later that day, Erica noticed something strange. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from friends and family, but many from unknown numbers, confused. She opened her social media accounts and was shocked to find her name trending. Someone had filmed the entire encounter with the police officer. A video had been posted, and it was spreading like wildfire. The footage showed the officer confronting Erica, demanding her identification and accusing her of suspicious behavior. The camera had captured every word, every moment of the humiliation she had endured, and now the entire world seemed to be watching it unfold. Her heart sank as she scrolled through the comments. Some people expressed outrage, their words of support, filling her inbox with messages of solidarity. Others, however, were less kind. She saw accusations of playing the victim, of making a big deal out of nothing. Some comments were outright hostile, questioning her character, her motives, even her right to live in such an affluent neighborhood. It was overwhelming. Erica had never wanted this kind of attention, never wanted to be thrust into the spotlight like this, but now there was no turning back. Her story was out there, and the world was reacting. Michael, on the other hand, saw the video as an opportunity. "This is good," he said, watching the footage with a critical eye. "This proves what happened. We can use this to hold them accountable." But look at the comments, Erica said, her voice shaking. "Some people don't even believe me. They're saying I'm just trying to get attention. People will always say what they want," Michael replied, his voice steady, but the facts are right there on video. That officer overstepped, and now we have proof. We'll take this to court if we have to. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, meetings with lawyers, and media attention. The local news picked up the story, and soon national outlets were running segments on the video. Erica found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't asked to lead, and while it was empowering to see so many people rallying behind her, it was also terrifying. She and Michael held a press conference outside their home, addressing the media for the first time since the video had gone viral. Erica stood beside her husband, her heart pounding in her chest as the cameras flashed and microphones were shoved toward her. Michael did most of the talking. But when it was her turn to speak, she found her voice. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident." She said, her voice firm, but laced with emotion. "This happens to people of color all the time, being judged, being targeted simply for existing in spaces that others don't think we belong in. But we do belong here, and we won't let this continue." The crowd of reporters buzzed with questions, but Erica stood tall beside Michael, her fear giving way to acquired strength she hadn't realized she possessed. This was bigger than her. Now it was about justice, about change. As the weeks passed, the case gained momentum. The Willowbrook Police Department issued a statement acknowledging the incident but refusing to admit wrongdoing. They claimed the officer had followed protocol, but Erica and Michael's legal team was determined to prove otherwise. The community began to rally around them, holding peaceful protests and demanding accountability from the police. The culmination of their efforts came on a bright Saturday afternoon. Hundreds of people gathered in Willowbrook's town square for a peaceful demonstration. They held signs that read, "Justice for Erica," and "In racial profiling." The square, which had once been the scene of Erica's humiliation, was now filled with voices demanding change. Erica stood at the front of the crowd, her hands gripping the edges of the podium as she prepared to speak. Michael was beside her, his presence steadying her. As always, she looked out at the sea of FA, some familiar other strangers who had come to support her. The sight was overwhelming, but also empowering. Taking a deep breath, Erica began to speak. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about a system that allows this kind of injustice to happen over and over again. It's about a society that still sees people like me as outsiders, no matter how hard we work, no matter how much we achieve. But we're not outsiders. We belong here, and we're not going to be silent anymore." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in unison. Erica's heart swelled with pride. She hadn't asked to be in this position, but now that she was here, she knew she couldn't back down. This fight was just beginning, and she was ready to lead it. Michael stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder as they looked out at the crowd together. "We're going to make a difference," he said softly. "This is only the beginning." Erica nodded her gaze, fixed on the faces before her. She felt a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. Change was possible, and with the support of her community and her husband by her side, she knew they could make it happen. As the protest continued, the sun began to set over Willowbrook, casting a warm golden light over the square. The same light that had once symbolized peace now symbolized something else: justice. And as Erica stood there, surrounded by people who believed in her, she knew that they were on the right path. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them, and together they would fight for a better future. Thank you for watching to the end. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos. Give us a like and click on the bell to be the first to know about the latest releases, and be sure to check out our other stories. They will definitely not leave you indifferent. Leave a comment below. What would you do in such a situation?